The peat was cold and black as iron. It pressed against flesh that had not felt air in 2,000 years. Above, the machine growled and churned, its blades cutting through centuries of compressed moss and earth. The workers did not expect to find a man. They expected only fuel for the winter, blocks of ancient vegetation dried and stacked for burning. But when the blade struck something soft, something that should not have been there, the engine stopped. Silence fell across the bog. One of the men climbed down into the trench. His boots sank into the wet earth. He knelt, pulled back a section of peat, and saw the curve of a human back, dark as leather, pressed flat by the weight of ages. The skin was intact, the body was whole, and though no one yet knew his name, though no one understood what had been done to him in the darkness of an Iron Age night, the man in the peat had returned. His death had been careful, his burial had been deliberate, and now, beneath the grey English sky of 1984, Lindow Man began to speak again. Chapter 1. The Discovery Beneath Lindow Moss. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the earth, let this be a moment of rest. Perhaps you're beneath blankets, or seated in the last light of evening, or walking through darkness with only a voice for company. You're welcome here. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so now. It helps us continue these journeys into the past and it ensures that more stories like this one can be told. Tonight, we venture into the peat bogs of England, into a discovery that shook the quiet fields of Cheshire and opened a window into a world 2,000 years gone. This is a story of preservation and violence, of a man who was killed with terrible care and buried in a place that would not let him decay. So settle in, let the outside world fall away, and let us drift backward through the centuries to a day in 84 when the earth gave up one of its oldest secrets. The morning of August 1st was grey and ordinary. The sky above Lindow Moss hung low, pressing moisture into the air that never quite became rain. The bog stretched wide and flat, a landscape of dark earth and scattered pools, broken only by the machinery of the peat extraction company that worked its surface. For decades, men had come here to cut blocks from the ancient moss, fuel for fires and gardens, layers of compressed vegetation that had taken millennia to form. The work was mechanical and monotonous. The cutting machines churned through the peat in long strips, carving trenches that exposed the black interior of the bure. The workers knew what to expect: roots, stones, occasionally the preserved remains of trees that had fallen before the Romans came. But on this morning, when the blade of the shredding mill struck something soft and foreign, the rhythm broke. The engine stopped. The silence that followed was sudden and total, filled only by the drip of water from the machine's teeth and the distant call of a bird across the moss. One of the workers climbed down from the platform. His name was lost to the records, but his actions were not. He knelt beside the trench, his boots sinking into the wet peat, and pulled back a section of loosened earth. What he saw made him go still. It was the curve of a human back. The skin was dark, stained the colour of old leather by the bog's chemistry, but it was whole. There were no bones protruding, no signs of recent burial, just the unmistakable shape of a man pressed flat into the peat as though sleeping. The worker called to his companions. They came slowly, uncertain, their faces tight with the kind of alarm that comes from finding death where none should be. One of them reached out and touched the exposed skin. It was cold and slightly waxy, slick with the oils that the bog had leached and replaced over centuries. Another man ran to the site office. Within an hour, the police arrived. They cordoned off the area with tape and began the careful work of excavation, believing at first that they had stumbled upon a recent crime. The peat was soft here, easier to disturb than the deeper layers. Perhaps someone had buried a body in the night. Perhaps this was a murder only months or years old. But as they dug, the truth began to shift. The body was not lying atop the peat. It was embedded within it, sunk deep into layers that had not been disturbed in living memory. The workers stood back and watched as the police lifted sections of earth, exposing more of the figure beneath, a leg, an arm, the curve of a skull pressed downward into the moss. The preservation was astonishing. Hair still clung to the scalp, fingernails remained intact on the hands. The skin, though darkened and compressed, showed the texture of muscle and tendon beneath. This was not the bloated decay of a body left in water. This was something else, something older. The police contacted the local coroner, who in turn reached out to the British Museum. By evening, archaeologists were on site. They worked through the fading light, their hands careful and their voices low, lifting the body in sections along with the peat that held it. They did not yet know his age. They did not yet understand what had been done to him. But they knew, with the instinct that comes from years of studying the past, that this was not a man of the 20th century. The peat had preserved him too well. The position of the body, the nakedness, the strange flattening of the torso, all suggested a burial far older than any modern crime. They transported the remains to the morgue in a series of plastic crates, each filled with wet peat to prevent the body from drying and collapsing. The smell was earthy and faintly acidic, the scent of ancient vegetation broken down into something neither soil nor water. In the sterile light of the examination room, the body lay on a steel table, still partially encased in the black moss that had held it for so long. The pathologist on duty was a man named Edmund Tapp. He had examined countless bodies in his career, victims of accident and violence and time, but he had never seen anything like this. The skin was intact across most of the body, though flattened by the pressure of the peat. The face was turned slightly to one side, the features compressed but recognizable. The eyes were closed. The mouth was slightly open. Hair covered the scalp in short reddish-brown strands, and a beard grew thick along the jawline. The hands were curled inward, the fingers long and narrow, the nails trimmed short. There was no clothing, no jewellery, no artefacts buried alongside the body, just the man himself, naked and alone in the earth. Tapp began the examination with caution. He noted the absence of decomposition, the way the bogs' chemistry had tanned the skin like leather, and halted the processes that should have reduced flesh to bone. He measured the body, approximately 5 feet 6 inches in length, though the compression made precise measurement difficult. He estimated the age at death to be between 20 and 30 years based on the development of the teeth and the condition of the bones. And then he found the injuries. The first was a fracture to the skull. It ran across the top of the head in a clean line, the kind of break caused by a single heavy blow. Tapp traced the edges with his gloved fingers. The bone had cracked but not shattered. The force had been significant but controlled. He moved to the neck. Here, beneath the preserved skin, he felt the displacement of vertebrae. The neck had been broken, but there was more. Wrapped around the throat was a cord, thin and dark, embedded so deeply into the flesh that it had become part of the body's surface. He lifted the head gently and saw that the cord was knotted at the back, a garrote pulled tight enough to compress the windpipe and the vessels that fed blood to the brain. And then, beneath the jaw, he found the third wound. A cut, narrow and precise, running horizontally across the throat from one side to the other. The edges were clean. The blade had been sharp. Tapp sat back, his mind racing through possibilities. 3 forms of violence inflicted upon the same body. A blow to the head, strangulation, the cutting of the throat. This was not the work of a single desperate act. This was deliberate. This was ritual. He called for a radiocarbon dating. Samples were taken from the body's tissue and sent to the laboratory at Oxford. The results came back within weeks. The man in the peat had died sometime between 2 BC and 119 AD. He was not a victim of modern crime. He was not even medieval. He was Iron Age. He had lived and died in the time of the Druids, in the years when Rome was tightening its grip on Britain, and the old gods still demanded blood. The news spread quickly, through the archaeological community, a body perfectly preserved from the 1st century. The newspapers picked up the story. Television crews arrived at Lindow Moss, filming the dark expanse of peat and interviewing the workers who had found him. The body was given a name drawn from the place of his discovery. They called him Lindow Man. Some began to call him Peat Marsh, a grim joke that softened the horror of his death. But the scientists did not joke. They knew what they had found. A window into a world that had left almost no written record. A man who'd been killed according to laws and beliefs that were now lost. A sacrifice, perhaps. An execution. A king. A criminal. A priest. No one yet knew, but the body would tell them if they could learn to read it properly. In the quiet of the laboratory, Lindow Man lay beneath bright lights, his skin still dark with the stain of the bog, his face still turned to the side as though listening for something that would never come. The scientists worked in silence, measuring and photographing, taking samples of tissue and hair and bone. Outside, the bog stretched away into the mist, vast and indifferent, holding secrets still unspoken. And somewhere in the past, in a night lit only by torches and stars, a man had knelt in the wet earth and accepted his death with a calmness that suggested he understood why it had to be done. The discovery was complete. The questions were only beginning. Chapter 2. The landscape of the ancestors. The land that would become Lindow Moss was not always a place of death and preservation. 2,000 years before the peat cutters found their unexpected burden, it was a living wetland, a place where water pooled and sedge grass grew tall, and the boundary between earth and sky dissolved into mist. The people who lived nearby knew it as a threshold, a meeting place between the world they could touch and the realm of forces they could only appease. They did not drain it or farm it. They respected its depths. And when the need arose, when the seasons turned wrong or the harvest failed, or the gods demanded acknowledgement, they came to its edge with offerings that would sink and never return. The bog lay in what is now Cheshire, in the northwest of England, a region that in the Iron Age was neither Roman nor fully resistant to Rome's coming shadow. The tribes here were Celtic, their language a branch of the ancient Brythonic tongue that would eventually fracture into Welsh and Cornish and Breton. They built their settlements on higher ground, clusters of round houses with walls of wattle and daub and roofs thatched with reeds. Smoke rose from central hearths. Animals grazed in paddocks enclosed by woven fences. The people wore wool dyed with plants and minerals, blues and reds and yellows drawn from woad and madder and lichen. They worked iron into tools and weapons, the metal heated in furnaces fueled by charcoal and beaten into shape on anvils of stone. But the bog was different. The bog was not a place for living. It was a place for remembering, for honouring, for giving back what had been taken from the earth. The water that filled it was dark and acidic, stained by the tannins of decomposing vegetation. Sphagnum moss grew thick across its surface, a carpet of green and gold that concealed the depths beneath. In some places, a man could walk across the moss without breaking through. In others, the surface gave way and the black water swallowed everything that touched it. The people knew where it was safe to tread. They had walked these paths for generations. They had marked the solid ground with stones and wooden posts, trails that led from the settlements to the heart of the wetland. Archaeologists working in the centuries after Lindow Man's discovery would find evidence of these paths. They would uncover wooden trackways preserved in the peat, timbers laid side by side to create walkways across the unstable ground. Some of these paths were narrow, meant for single travellers. Others were wide enough for processions. The wood was oak and alder, trees that grew along the bog's edges and were felled with bronze axes in the centuries before iron became common. The construction was careful. The planks were split and shaped, fitted together without nails, held in place by stakes driven deep into the underlying peat. These were not casual routes. They were built with intention, maintained over decades, perhaps over centuries. They led to specific places within the bog, places that mattered. The wetland itself was part of a larger landscape shaped by ritual and belief. In the Iron Age, the natural world was not separate from the divine. Rivers were goddesses. Springs were entrances to the underworld. Forests were the dwelling places of spirits that could heal or harm. And bogs, with their capacity to preserve and conceal, were understood as liminal spaces where offerings could pass from the realm of the living to the realm of the gods. Objects thrown into the water did not simply sink, they were transformed. They became part of a different reality, one that existed beneath the surface and beyond the reach of ordinary human concerns. Evidence of this belief could be found across Celtic Europe. In Denmark, archaeologists had discovered bodies in peat bogs, men and women killed with the same careful violence as Lindow Man. In Ireland, wooden platforms had been built out over the water, stages from which ritual objects were cast into the depths. In Switzerland, lakes had yielded thousands of bronze swords and shields and tools, deliberately broken and thrown into the water as gifts that could never be reclaimed. The pattern was consistent. Water was a conduit, wetlands were sacred, and the things given to them, whether metal or grain or human life, were given without expectation of return. The people who lived near Lindow Moss in the 1st century understood this. They would have known the stories passed down by their elders, tales of ancestors who had walked to the bog's edge in times of crisis and left behind what was most precious. They would have seen the wooden posts that mark the pathways, some of them ancient even then, grey and weather-worn by centuries of rain and frost. They would have heard the sounds of the wetland, the calls of waterfowl and the rustle of reeds and the occasional deep gurgle of gas rising from the decomposing layers below. And they would have known, with the certainty that comes from living close to the land, that the bog was watching, that it remembered, that it held the dead in a way that no grave could match. The climate of Iron Age Britain was cooler and wetter than the Mediterranean world to the south. Rain fell often, turning the dirt paths between settlements into rivers of mud. The summers were brief and the winters long, the sky grey more often than blue. Fire was essential. Every household kept a hearth burning, the flames fed with wood and peat cut from the edges of the wetlands. The smoke rose through holes in the thatch, carrying with it the smell of cooking meat and baking bread and the sweat of bodies pressed close for warmth. At night, when the fires burned low, the darkness was total. There were no streetlights, no lanterns bright enough to push back the shadows. The people slept in the knowledge that beyond their walls the world was full of things they could not control. They marked time by the turning of the seasons, by the festivals that divided the year into segments of planting and harvest and rest. Samhain in autumn, when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Imbolc in winter, when the first lambs were born and the promise of spring began to stir. Beltane in summer, when fires were lit on hilltops and cattle were driven between the flames for protection. Lugnasad in late summer, when the grain was cut and the work of the harvest consumed every daylight hour. These were not merely agricultural markers. They were moments of communion with forces larger than individual lives. The gods who controlled the weather and the fertility of the soil and the outcome of battles. The ancestors who had passed into the otherworld but still held influence over the living. The spirits of place, tied to specific hills and rivers and groves. The Druids were the keepers of this knowledge. They were priests and judges and healers, men who had spent decades memorizing the oral traditions of their people. They did not write. They believed that sacred knowledge should be held in the mind and passed from master to student through years of training. They knew the cycles of the moon and the movements of the stars. They understood the properties of plants, which could cure and which could kill. They presided over sacrifices, determining what the gods required and when and how the offerings should be made. They were separate from the warriors and the farmers, a class apart, respected and feared in equal measure. Romans. Writers who encountered the Druids described them with a mixture of fascination and horror. Pliny the Elder wrote of their rituals involving mistletoe, the plant cut from oak trees with golden sickles during the 6th night of the moon. Julius Caesar claimed they burned criminals and captives in great wicker figures, human sacrifices offered to ensure victory in war or abundance in harvest. Tacitus recounted the Roman assault on the Druid stronghold of Anglesey, where black-robed women stood among the priests and cursed the invaders with words that chilled the soldiers' resolve. These accounts were written by outsiders, men who viewed Celtic religion through the lens of Roman superiority, but they hinted at practices that archaeology would later confirm. The Druids did preside over sacrifices, They did hold power over life and death, and they did understand the bog as a place where such offerings could be made. Lindow Moss in the 1st century was part of this world. It was not isolated. Nearby settlements traded with communities across the region, exchanging pottery and metalwork and news of the wider world. Roman goods had begun to appear in the decades before the conquest. Glass beads and bronze brooches and wine amphorae brought north by merchants who moved along the ancient trade routes. Some tribes had made alliances with Rome, hoping to secure advantages over their rivals. Others resisted, clinging to the old ways and the old gods. The Druids were caught in the middle. Their influence was threatened by Rome's advance. Their sacred places were being destroyed, their groves cut down, their centres of learning burned. In such a time, the need for powerful rituals would have been acute. The gods had to be reminded of their people. The ancestors had to be called upon. And the bog, with its capacity to hold and preserve, would have been one of the places where such communication was made. The man who had become Lindow Man lived in this landscape. He breathed its air and walked its paths and knew its rhythms. He would have seen the bog countless times, perhaps from childhood. He would have understood what it meant when someone was chosen to go there. He would have known that the journey to the water's edge was not a punishment, but a transformation, a passage from one state of being to another. And when his own time came, when the Druids made their decision and the community gathered to witness, he would have walked toward the moss with the weight of that knowledge pressing upon him like the sky itself. The land waited, the water waited, and history, without knowing it yet, prepared to remember. Chapter 3. The Man Who Would Not Decay. The body lay on the steel table beneath lights that never flickered. Around it, scientists moved with the careful precision of those who understood they were handling something irreplaceable. This was not merely a corpse. It was a document written in flesh and bone, a text that could be read only once before the act of reading destroyed it. Every cut made for sampling, every measurement taken, every photograph captured. Each action removed something that could never be restored. And so they worked slowly, methodically, recording everything before they touched anything, building a catalogue of observations that would outlive the body itself. The preservation was extraordinary. In the normal course of death, bacteria consume soft tissue within days, breaking down muscle and organ and skin into compounds that leach into the surrounding soil. Bones remain, sometimes for millennia, but the person within the bones vanishes. Yet here was a man whose skin still covered his frame, whose hair still grew from his scalp, whose fingernails still curved at the ends of his fingers. The peat had done what no embalmer could achieve. It had stopped time, not completely, but enough. Enough to hold the shape of a human being across 2,000 years. The chemistry of the bog explained this miracle. Sphagnum moss, the dominant plant in wetlands like Lindow, releases acids as it decays. These acids lower the pH of the water, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause decomposition. The acidity also tans the skin, a process similar to the treatment of leather, turning collagen into a stable, durable substance that resists breakdown. Meanwhile, the cold temperatures of the bog slow all chemical reactions. The lack of oxygen prevents aerobic bacteria from thriving. And the layers of peat that build up over centuries press down with tremendous weight, flattening bodies into the sediment and sealing them away from air and light and the passage of seasons above. The scientists had seen this effect in other bog bodies. The Lindow Man, discovered in Denmark in 1950, had been so well preserved that the workers who found him called the police, believing him to be a recent murder victim. His face was peaceful, his eyes closed, his skin dark and leathery but intact. Around his neck was a rope, still knotted, evidence of a death by hanging 2,000 years before. The Lindow Man, found in the same country in 1952, had his throat cut, the wound still visible as a clean line across the preserved tissue. These bodies had emerged from the peat as ambassadors from a world that left few other traces. And now Lindow Man joined their number, the first such discovery in Britain in modern times. The examination began with external observation. The body measured 168 centimetres from head to heel, though the compression of the peat made this measurement approximate. The weight was 64 kilograms, much of it the waterlogged peat that still clung to the skin and filled the body's cavities. The scientists photographed every angle, every surface, building a visual record that could be studied for years after the body itself had been stabilized and placed in storage. They noted the position of the limbs. The left arm was bent at the elbow, the hand resting near the chest. The right arm extended downward, the fingers slightly curled. Both legs were folded, the knees drawn up toward the torso. This was not the rigid posture of a body laid out for burial. This was the position of someone crouching or kneeling, pressed down into the earth. The head drew their attention first. It was turned to the right, the face compressed but recognizable. The scientists could see the line of the jaw, the curve of the cheekbones, the ridge of the brow. The nose had been flattened by the weight of the peat, but its shape was still evident. The eyes were closed, the lids sunken into the sockets where the soft tissue of the eyeballs had finally succumbed to time. The mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were surprisingly intact. They counted 28 teeth, worn but healthy, with no sign of decay. This suggested a diet low in sugar, a mouth that had chewed coarse bread and fibrous vegetables and occasional meat, but not the honey cakes and fermented drinks that rotted the teeth of wealthier individuals in later centuries. The hair was the most striking feature. It grew thick across the scalp and down the sides of the face, forming a beard and moustache that gave the man a dignified, almost noble appearance. The colour was reddish-brown, though the scientists knew this was misleading. The bog's chemistry altered pigments, turning blonde hair orange and dark hair auburn. They would need to analyse the keratin to determine the original colour. But regardless of hue, the presence of hair at all was remarkable. Hair is protein, and protein should decompose. Yet here it remained, each strand preserved, each follicle still rooted in the scalp. The hands were examined next. The fingers were long and slender, the nails trimmed short. There were no calluses on the palms, no thickening of the skin that would suggest a lifetime of hard manual labour. This observation sparked immediate speculation. Was this a man who had worked with his hands, or one who had been exempt from such toil? The absence of calluses did not necessarily indicate high status. It could mean he was young, that his hands had not yet hardened, or it could mean his work was of a different nature, intellectual rather than physical. The Druids were described as scholars, men who memorized laws and genealogies and astronomical calculations. Such work left no mark on the palms. The scientists moved to the injuries. The skull fracture was examined with X-rays and CT scans, technology that allowed them to see beneath the skin without cutting. The break ran from the top of the head down toward the left temple, a clean line that suggested a single blow from a blunt object. They estimated the force required, significant but not overwhelming, enough to crack bone but not to shatter it, enough to cause unconsciousness perhaps, but not immediate death. The weapon could have been a wooden club or a stone axe, or even a metal blade struck with the flat side. The angle of the blow suggested the attacker stood in front of the victim, slightly to the left, and brought the weapon down in a controlled arc. The cord around the neck was more complex. It was made of sinew, animal tendon twisted into a thin rope approximately 1.5 millimeters in diameter. The cord had been wrapped twice around the throat and knotted at the back, the knot positioned just below the base of the skull. The pressure had been extreme. The skin beneath the cord was compressed to half its normal thickness, the tissues squeezed until blood and fluid were forced out. The scientists could trace the path of the cord through the flesh, see where it had cut deepest and where it had merely pressed. The hyoid bone in the throat was fractured, a common finding in cases of strangulation. The vertebrae of the neck were displaced, the second and third cervical bones pushed out of alignment by the force of the ligature. But the strangulation alone had not killed him. The third wound, the cut across the throat, was deeper and more deliberate than they had first realized. The blade had entered just below the right ear and swept horizontally across the front of the neck, severing the jugular vein and the carotid artery on the right side. The cut was clean, made with a sharp edge, likely iron given the time period. The depth varied, deeper on the right where the blade entered and shallower on the left where it exited. This was not a hesitant wound. This was a practiced motion, the kind of cut made by someone who knew anatomy and knew how to end a life quickly. 3 injuries, 3 methods of death. The scientists debated the sequence. Had the blow to the head come first, stunning the victim? Had the cord been applied while he was unconscious, tightened until breathing stopped? And had the throat been cut afterward, a final act to ensure death was complete? Or had all 3 occurred in rapid succession, a cascade of violence that left no time for struggle? The body offered clues but no certainties. There were no defensive wounds on the hands or arms, no broken fingers or cut palms that would suggest he had tried to fight back. This absence was as telling as the wounds themselves. Either he had been restrained, or he had not resisted. Either he was unconscious, or he was willing. The preservation of the soft tissue allowed for one more examination that would have been impossible with skeletal remains alone. The scientists removed the stomach and its contents, cutting carefully through the abdominal wall to access the digestive tract. What they found inside would open another window into the hours before death. But for now, they focused on cataloguing the body itself, measuring and photographing and sampling, building a profile of the man who had died so long ago. He had been in his mid-20s, they estimated, based on the fusion of his bones and the wear on his teeth. He had stood between 5 feet 6 and 5 feet 8 inches tall, average for the period. His build was slender but not frail, the musculature visible beneath the preserved skin suggesting a body capable of physical exertion but not devoted to it. There were no signs of old injuries, no healed fractures or scars that might tell stories of battles or accidents. His health, prior to his death, appeared to have been good. He had not suffered from malnutrition or disease. He had not borne the marks of a hard life, and he had died naked. No clothing had been found with the body, no belt or shoes or cloak. This detail was crucial. Clothing was valuable in the Iron Age. Each garment woven by hand from wool or linen, dyed with expensive pigments, sewn with hours of labour. No one would have removed a corpse's clothing unless there was a reason, and no one would have gone willingly into the cold and wet of a bog without protection unless the nakedness itself was part of the ritual. The absence of clothes suggested deliberation. This was not a man who had stumbled into the wetland and drowned. This was a man who'd been prepared for what was to come. The scientists worked through the winter of 1984 and into the spring of 1985. They published their findings in academic journals, presented their results at conferences, debated interpretations with colleagues across Europe, and slowly a picture emerged. Not complete, never complete, but enough to glimpse the outline of a story. A young man, healthy, killed with precision, given to the bog. The details would come later, teased out from the fragments of evidence that remained. But the foundation was set. Lindow Man had been someone, and someone had decided he needed to die. Chapter 4. The Triple Death. The ancients had a word for it, though the language is lost now. The triple death, the threefold killing, a form of execution or sacrifice in which a single victim was killed 3 times over, each method sufficient to end life, each applied in sequence as though one death were not enough. The concept appeared in Celtic mythology, in tales of kings and heroes who met their ends through fire and water and blade, through hanging and drowning and spearing. The stories hinted at a belief that some deaths required more than the mere cessation of breath. They required transformation. They required the victim to pass through multiple thresholds, to be claimed by multiple gods to ensure that the offering was complete. Lindow Man bore the marks of such a death. The scientists examining his body in the laboratories of the British Museum understood that the violence inflicted upon him was not random. Each injury was deliberate. Each method was specific. And together, they formed a pattern that reached back through centuries of ritual practice. A pattern that suggested his death was not murder in the ordinary sense, but something closer to ceremony. The blow to the head came first, they believed. The fracture. Line ran from the crown of the skull down toward the temple, a trajectory that indicated a downward strike from a weapon held above. The scientists experimented with reconstructions, using models and force calculations to estimate the weight and velocity required to produce such a break. They concluded the weapon was likely wooden, a club perhaps 3 feet in length and 2 inches in diameter, swung with moderate force by someone standing directly in front of the victim. The blow would have been stunning, but not immediately fatal. The skull did not shatter. The brain was not penetrated. But the impact would have caused severe concussion, a moment of disorientation or unconsciousness that rendered the victim incapable of resistance. The placement of the blow was significant. It was not aimed at the face or the back of the head, the targets one would choose in a moment of rage or panic. It was aimed at the top of the skull, the highest point, as though the attacker intended to strike downward from a position of authority. This suggested ritual rather than combat. In many cultures, the head was understood as the seat of the soul, the part of the body most closely connected to the divine. To strike the head was to acknowledge its importance, to mark the victim as someone whose essence needed to be released or redirected. The Druids were said to venerate the head above all other parts of the body. They kept the skulls of enemies and ancestors, displaying them in sacred spaces or burying them beneath doorways to serve as guardians. A blow to the head in the context of sacrifice might have been a way of opening the pathway between the earthly and the otherworldly, cracking the bone to let the spirit escape. The cord came next. The scientists found it still wrapped around the neck, embedded so deeply into the flesh that it had become part of the skin's surface. The cord was made of sinew, the dried and twisted tendons of an animal, probably a deer or a cow. Sinew was stronger than plant fibre, less likely to break under tension, and its use suggested planning. Someone had prepared this ligature in advance, selecting the material and crafting it into a tool designed for a specific purpose. The cord measured approximately 18 inches in length before being tied. It had been wrapped twice around the throat, the loops overlapping at the front, and then knotted tightly at the back of the neck. The knot was a simple overhand, the kind used in countless contexts for securing rope or cord, but its position was precise. It sat just below the base of the skull, in the hollow where the neck meets the head. This placement allowed for maximum leverage. When the ends of the cord were pulled, the knot acted as a fulcrum, tightening the loops around the throat and compressing the windpipe and the major blood vessels on either side. The scientists found evidence of this compression in the preserved tissue. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone that sits above the larynx, was fractured. This fracture is a classic sign of strangulation, occurring when pressure is applied to the throat with sufficient force to break the delicate structure. The carotid arteries, which carry blood to the brain, would have been blocked within seconds. Unconsciousness would have followed quickly, usually within 10 to 15 seconds. Death, if the pressure were maintained, would come within 3 to 5 minutes. But again, the method suggested more than simple execution. Strangulation by ligature was a common form of sacrifice in Iron Age Europe. The Tolland man in Denmark had died this way, a rope around his neck pulled tight enough to leave a groove in the skin. The Elling woman, found in the same region, had been hanged, her body placed in the bog after death. The use of a cord rather than a rope or a noose indicated control. Hanging typically involved suspending the body, allowing gravity to do the work. But a cord wrapped around the throat required someone to pull, to maintain tension, to actively participate in the killing. This was hands-on, this was intimate, and it transformed the act from a distant judgment into a direct transfer of life from one person to another. The throat cutting was the final step. The wound ran horizontally across the front of the neck, entering just below the right ear and exiting near the left jawline. The blade had penetrated deeply on the right side, cutting through skin and muscle and severing the jugular vein and carotid artery. The depth decreased as the cut moved left, suggesting either a soaring motion or a loss of pressure as the blade travelled. The edges of the wound were clean, indicating a sharp implement. Iron blades of the period could achieve such sharpness, especially if freshly honed. Bronze, while capable of holding an edge, was softer and would have left a rougher cut. The scientists concluded the weapon was likely an iron knife, perhaps 6 to 8 inches in length, wielded by someone with skill and familiarity. The throat cutting would have caused rapid exsanguination. With the carotid artery severed, blood loss would have been catastrophic, measured in seconds rather than minutes, but by this point the victim was likely already dead or dying from the strangulation. The blow to the head had rendered him unconscious. The cord had stopped his breathing and his heartbeat. The knife, then, was not strictly necessary to end his life. It was an additional act, performed after the other two methods had done their work. This redundancy was key to understanding the ritual nature of the death. Each injury corresponded to a different element, a different god, a different form of passage. The blow invoked air, the sudden shock of impact. The cord invoked earth, the slow compression and the cessation of breath. The blade invoked water, the spilling of blood and the flow of life outward. The threefold death appeared in Celtic literature as a motif of sovereignty and sacrifice. In one Irish tale, a king named Diarmaid Mac Cabal was killed 3 times, burned in a house, pierced with a spear and drowned in a vat of ale, each death fulfilling a prophecy and marking the end of his reign. In another story, the hero Cuchulainn died standing upright, tied to a pillar with his enemies too afraid to approach, until a raven landed on his shoulder to confirm his spirit had departed. These narratives were written down centuries after the events they described, transcribed by Christian monks who filtered pagan traditions through their own religious lens. But beneath the layers of revision, the pattern persisted. Death was not singular, it was multiple. And the most important deaths required the victim to be killed in several ways to ensure the transition was complete. The scientists debated whether Lindow Man's death was execution or sacrifice, and whether such a distinction even mattered in the context of Iron Age belief. Execution implied wrongdoing, a punishment for transgression. Sacrifice implied offering, a gift to powers beyond human control. But in a society where law and religion were inseparable, where the gods were understood to be active participants in human affairs, the two concepts merged. A criminal could be sacrificed. A king could be executed. The method mattered more than the motive. And the method used on Lindow Man was the method reserved for those whose deaths carried weight, whose passage from life to death needed to be witnessed and controlled and made meaningful. There was another detail that suggested ritual. The body showed no signs of struggle. The hands bore no defensive wounds. The arms had no bruises. The legs had no abrasions. If Lindow Man had fought, if he had resisted, the evidence would have been present. Bones would have been broken. Skin would have been torn. But he was intact, his injuries limited to the 3 deliberate acts that ended his life. This absence of struggle indicated one of 2 possibilities. Either he was restrained so completely that resistance was impossible, or he did not resist. And if he did not resist, the question became why. What belief or understanding allowed a man to accept such a death without fighting? What knowledge or faith made him willing? The scientists could only speculate. Perhaps he was drugged, given a substance that dulled fear and pain. The contents of his stomach would offer clues, but those results were still being analysed. Perhaps he believed his death served a greater purpose, that his life was being traded for the welfare of his community. Perhaps he was chosen, marked from birth or selected in adulthood, and raised with the knowledge that his end would come in this manner. Or perhaps he was forced, bound and held, and the absence of struggle was simply the result of effective restraint. The body could not answer these questions. It could only show what had been done, not what had been felt or thought or accepted. What remained certain was the precision, the care, the deliberate nature of each act. Lindow Man had not been killed in haste. He had not been dispatched by a mob or struck down in anger. He had been killed according to a plan, by people who knew what they were doing and why. And when the killing was finished, when the blood had stopped flowing and the heart had ceased its rhythm, his body had been carried to the bog and given to the water, not buried in earth where it might be reclaimed, not burned where it might ascend as smoke, but placed in the wetland, in the boundary piece where it would be held and preserved and kept. A gift that could not be taken back. A message sent to gods who might never reply. Chapter 5. The Druids' Offering. The Druids moved through the landscape like shadows cast by a fire that had long since burned out. By the time Rome came to Britain, their influence was already waning, their sacred groves falling to the axe, their oral traditions fragmenting under the pressure of a new order that wrote its laws on tablets and built its temples in stone. But in the 1st century, in the years when Lindow Man drew breath, they still held power. They were judges and astronomers, healers and historians, keepers of knowledge that took 20 years to memorize and a lifetime to understand. They did not rule in the manner of kings, but no king made decisions without consulting them. They stood between the people and the gods, interpreting signs and determining what the divine required. The Roman writers who documented their practices did so with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. They were outsiders looking in, soldiers and administrators who saw Celtic religion through the lens of their own beliefs and political interests. Their accounts must be read with caution, but they are among the few written records that survive, and they speak consistently of one aspect of Druidic practice that archaeology has confirmed. The Druids presided over human sacrifice. They believed that certain crises required certain offerings, and that the most potent offering was human life. Julius Caesar, who encountered the Druids during his campaigns in Gaul, wrote that they constructed enormous figures from wicker, hollow structures shaped like men, and filled them with living prisoners who were then burned alive. He claimed this was done to ensure victory in war, to appease gods who demanded blood in exchange for favour. Strabo, writing a generation later, described similar practices among the Celts, noting that victims were sometimes stabbed in the back and their death throes observed for omens, the convulsions interpreted as messages from the divine. Pliny the Elder wrote of Druidic rituals involving mistletoe oak, describing ceremonies where white-robed priests climbed sacred trees to cut the parasitic plant with golden sickles, catching it in white cloaks before it could touch the ground, and then sacrificing white bulls beneath the branches. These accounts were propaganda in part. Rome needed to justify its conquest of Celtic territories, and portraying the Druids as bloodthirsty barbarians served that purpose. But the archaeological evidence suggests the Romans were not inventing these practices out of whole cloth. They were describing, however imperfectly, rituals that did occur. The bog bodies scattered across northern Europe bore witness to this. Men and women killed with care, their bodies placed in wetlands that preserved them across millennia. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, the violence too specific to be random murder. The question the scientists examining Lindow Man had to consider was not whether human sacrifice occurred in Iron Age Britain, but why. What circumstances prompted a community to kill one of its own and offer the body to the gods? The answer lay in understanding the world as the Celts understood it, a world where human action and divine will were intimately connected, where the fertility of the land and the success of the harvest and the outcome of battles depended on maintaining proper relationships with forces beyond mortal control. The gods of the Celts were not abstract. They were immanent, present in rivers and mountains and forests, in the turning of the seasons and the flight of birds. They had preferences and demands. They could be generous or cruel, and they responded to offerings. Small gifts were appropriate for small needs. A coin thrown into a spring might secure safe passage, a bronze brooch cast into a lake might bring healing to a sick child. But great needs required great gifts. A drought that threatened starvation, an invasion that threatened annihilation, a plague that killed without mercy. These crises called for the most valuable thing a community possessed, human life itself. But not just any life. The evidence suggested that victims were chosen carefully. Lindow Man, the Danish bog body discovered in 950, had a peaceful expression despite the rope around his neck, leading some scholars to suggest he had been drugged or had gone willingly. Man, found 2 years later, had eaten a final meal rich in grain, suggesting his death followed a feast or ceremony. Lindow Man's hands showed no signs of heavy labour, his body no marks of old injuries. He was healthy, young, intact. These were not criminals pulled from prisons or captives taken in war, or if they were treated differently than ordinary prisoners. They were prepared for death in ways that suggested their role was not punishment but offering. The selection process itself is lost to history. The Druids left no written records. The oral traditions they maintained for generations died with them when Rome destroyed their centres of learning and forbade their practices. But hints survive in later Celtic literature, stories transcribed by Christian monks centuries after the fact. In these tales, kings were sometimes sacrificed when their reigns failed, when the land became barren or enemies too strong. The king's life was bound to the land's fertility, and if the bond broke, his death could restore it. In other stories, individuals volunteered to die on behalf of their people, offering themselves as substitutes for collective disaster. The Druids would have known the calendar, the moments when the veil between worlds grew thin. Samhain, at the end of October when the dead were said to walk among the living. Beltane at the beginning of May, when fires were lit to protect cattle and ensure abundance. These festivals mark transitions, dangerous times when proper rituals were essential. A death performed at the right moment in the right manner could redirect fate. It could turn a bad harvest into a good one, a lost battle into a victory, a plague into health. The location of the sacrifice mattered as much as the timing. The bog was not arbitrary. It was a threshold, a place where earth and water merged, where the solid gave way to the liquid, where things could pass from one realm to another. The Druids understood geography as sacred text. Certain places held power. Hills where the sun rose on specific days, groves where lightning had struck, springs that never ran dry, and wetlands dark and deep, where offerings could sink beyond recovery and be held into the cold embrace of the peat until even memory faded. Lindow Moss would have been known to the Druids of the region. The wooden trackways that led into the bog were centuries old by the time Lindow Man died, proof that people had been travelling to this place for generations. What they brought with them has mostly been lost, decayed beyond recognition, or dredged up by peat cutters who did not understand the significance of what they found. But fragments remain. In other bogs across Europe, archaeologists have recovered bronze swords bent deliberately before being thrown into the water, shields with their centres removed, cauldrons filled with animal bones, and human remains that show the same careful violence as Lindow Man. The rituals themselves must be imagined from these fragments. There would have been preparation, days or weeks of fasting and purification for the victim. There would have been ceremony, processions from the settlement to the bog's edge, torches lighting the way if the sacrifice occurred at night. There would have been witnesses, the community gathered to observe, their presence essential to validate the offering. And there would have been the Druids, white-robed or black-robed depending on the occasion, speaking words in a language that is now extinct, invoking gods whose names have been forgotten. The triple death fits within this framework. Each method of killing corresponded to a different element, a different deity, a different aspect of the cosmos. The blow to the head invoked air, the realm of birds and storms and breath. The strangulation invoked earth, the realm of roots and burial and the deep places where ancestors slept. The cutting of the throat invoked water, the realm of rivers and rain and the blood that flows like river does through the body. By killing the victim 3 times, the Druids ensured the offering reached all the necessary powers, that no god was overlooked, that the sacrifice was complete in every dimension. Lindow Man, standing at the edge of the bog in the moments before his death, would have understood this. He would have been raised in a culture where such rituals were known, where stories of past sacrifices were told around fires and in sacred spaces. He would have seen the bog many times, perhaps brought offerings there himself in better years. and now it was his turn. Whether he was willing or drugged or restrained, whether he believed his death would save his people or simply accepted it as inevitable, he walked or was carried to the water's edge. The Druids performed their rites. The blows were struck, and his body, naked and prepared, was given to the peat. The water closed over him, the moss grew above him. The seasons turned and turned again, and the people who had known him died and were forgotten. The Druids themselves vanished, hunted by Rome, their tradition suppressed, their knowledge scattered. The bog held him through it all, through the collapse of Celtic Britain and the rise of Saxon kingdoms, and the arrival of Christianity, and the slow transformation of the landscape into something unrecognizable. He sank deeper into the peat, pressed down by the weight of accumulation until he was part of the bog itself, another layer in the archive of the earth. And then, 2,000 years later, a machine cut through the peat and brought him back. The Druids who killed him could not have imagined this resurrection. They believed they were sending him to the gods, a one-way journey into the other world. They could not have known that the bog would preserve him, that future generations would pull him from the water and study him and try to understand what they had done. The offering was meant to be final, but the peat had other plans. It held him not as a gift to the gods, but as a message to the future, a record of a world where human life could be traded for divine favour, where death was not an end but a transformation, and where the boundary between the living and the dead was as thin as the surface of a bog. Chapter 6. The Last Meal. The stomach was removed with care, a small organ no larger than a clenched fist, extracted from the preserved tissue and placed in a sterile container for analysis. 2,000 years had passed since food last entered it, since the muscles of the esophagus pushed a final swallow downward and the acids began their work of breaking nutrients into usable compounds. But the peat had stopped that process midway, freezing the contents in a state of partial digestion that would allow modern science to reconstruct the last meal with startling precision. What a man ate before he died could reveal much about his life and the circumstances of his death. It could tell whether he was a peasant or a noble, whether his final hours were ordinary or ceremonial, whether he knew what was coming. The contents were carefully washed and sifted, the partially digested material separated under microscopes and identified grain by grain, seed by seed. The scientists worked slowly, documenting everything, aware that this was information that could never be recovered again if lost. What they found was unexpected. The stomach contained the remains of a griddle cake, a flatbread made from a mixture of grains that had been ground into flour, mixed with water, and cooked on a hot stone or iron plate. The grains themselves were identifiable even after digestion. Barley dominated the mixture, the hardy crop that grew well in the cool, wet climate of Iron Age Britain. But there was also wheat, and something else. Small dark seeds that took longer to identify. They were the seeds of weeds, charred and broken, mixed throughout the flour. Not just a few accidental inclusions from poorly cleaned grain, but a significant proportion of the total mass. Fat hen, a common weed that grew in fields and disturbed ground. Knotgrass, another unwanted plant that farmers spent their summers pulling from between rows of crops. These seeds were edible technically, and in times of scarcity they were sometimes gathered and ground along with grain to stretch the food supply. But their presence in such quantities suggested the griddle cake was made from poor quality flour, the sweepings of the granary mixed with whatever could be found. This discovery contradicted earlier theories. If Lindow Man had been a person of high status, a druid or a nobleman selected for sacrifice, one would expect his final meal to reflect that status. The last suppers of condemned prisoners in later cultures often included special foods, a gesture of respect or mercy before death. But this meal was humble, even impoverished. The bread was coarse and full of weeds. There were no traces of meat or fish. No evidence of honey or fruit or the ale that was common to Celtic feasts. Just the rough sustenance of someone living on the margins, eating what was available rather than what was desired. But then the scientists found something that changed the interpretation entirely. Mixed among the grain fragments and weed seeds were grains of pollen, microscopic structures that had survived digestion and preservation. Pollen analysis is a delicate art, requiring patience and expertise to identify species from the shape and texture of grains that are smaller than a breadth of human hair. The pollen in Lindow Man's stomach came from mistletoe. Mistletoe did not grow in grain fields. It was a parasitic plant that grew on trees, particularly oak and apple, sending roots into the host branches and drawing nutrients from the wood. It produced small white berries in winter, a flash of life against bare branches, and it was sacred to the Druids. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, described elaborate ceremonies involving mistletoe, how the Druids would not touch it with iron, but only with golden sickles, how it was caught in white cloth before it could fall to the ground, how its presence made the oak tree holy. The mistletoe pollen in Lindow Man's stomach was not accidental. Mistletoe did not find its way into bread through contamination. It had to be added deliberately, either mixed into the flour or consumed separately just before the meal. And its presence transformed the interpretation of the last meal from impoverishment to ritual. The coarse bread, the weed seeds, the absence of other foods, all these details suddenly appeared not as signs of low status, but as signs of ceremony. This was not a meal meant to satisfy hunger. This was a meal meant to prepare the body for death, to mark the person who ate it as someone chosen, someone set apart. The scientists researched mistletoe's properties. In small quantities, it was medicinal, used by Celtic healers to treat seizures and inflammation. In larger quantities, it was toxic, causing nausea and slowed heartbeat and, in extreme cases, cardiac arrest. The amount in Lindow Man's stomach was difficult to determine from the pollen alone, but the presence of the plant at all suggested intentionality. Perhaps he was drugged, given enough mistletoe to dull his senses and make him compliant. Perhaps the plant was symbolic, its sacred nature transforming the bread into something more than food, a communion with the divine. The timing of the meal was also significant. The stomach's contents were partially digested, broken down but not fully absorbed. The scientists estimated that death had occurred between 2 and 4 hours after eating. This meant the meal was not a casual breakfast or a midday snack. It was a final act of consumption, taken with the knowledge perhaps that no other meal would follow. The victim had eaten and then walked or been led to the bog and then died. The season of death could be inferred from the pollen as well. Mistletoe bloomed in late winter and early spring, its flowers small and inconspicuous but pollen rich. The presence of mistletoe pollen suggested the sacrifice occurred during this period, sometime between February and April. This timing aligned with Celtic festivals. Imbolc, celebrated at the beginning of February, marked the first stirrings of spring, the lengthening of days, the return of fertility to the land. It was a time associated with fire and purification, with the goddess Brigid and the lighting of flames. A sacrifice at Imbolc would have been an offering to ensure the growing season, to wake the earth from winter's sleep and call forth abundance. But there was another possibility. The pollen could have come from mistletoe harvested and dried months earlier, stored and used in ceremonies throughout the year. The Druids were said to prize mistletoe cut during the 6th night of the moon, a specific timing that suggests careful observation of celestial cycles. If they stored the plant for ritual use, then Lindow Man's death could have occurred at any time, the mistletoe added to his final meal as a marker of sacred purpose rather than an indicator of season. The scientists compared Lindow Man's last meal to those of other bog bodies. Tolland Man's stomach had contained a porridge made from barley and flax and various seeds, also poor in quality, also eaten hours before death. Grauballe Man's meal was similar, a gruel of grains and weeds with no trace of meat or luxury. The pattern held across multiple discoveries, multiple centuries, multiple regions. The final meals of sacrificial victims were deliberately humble, stripped of the foods that brought pleasure or signified status. This humility might have been symbolic, a rejection of earthly wealth before passage to the other world. Or it might have been practical, a way to ensure the victim's stomach was not empty, but also not full enough to cause discomfort during the ritual. There was a phrase in later Irish literature, recorded by monks who wrote down the old stories centuries after Christianity had replaced the Druids. The phrase was the king's portion, and it referred to a special cut of meat given to rulers at feasts, a mark of their status and power. But in some tales, the phrase took on a darker meaning. The king's portion was also the portion given to a king before he was sacrificed, before his failure to protect the land required his death and replacement. If this tradition reached back into the Iron Age, if Lindow Man had been a ruler whose reign had ended badly, then his humble final meal could be understood as an inversion of the king's portion. Not meat and honey and ale, but bread and weeds and sacred plants. Not a feast to celebrate power, but a meal to mark its surrender. The contents of the stomach were catalogued and stored, samples preserved for future analysis as technology improved and new questions arose. But the meal itself, the actual griddle cake that Lindow Man had eaten 2,000 years before, was gone. It had been consumed and digested and reduced to fragments that could only hint at the whole. The scientists could reconstruct the ingredients, estimate the timing, speculate about the ritual significance, but they could not taste it. They could not feel its texture or smell its aroma, or know whether it was eaten willingly or forced down a reluctant throat. What remained was the knowledge that in the hours before his death, Lindow Man had eaten bread made from coarse grain and weed seeds, mixed with mistletoe pollen that marked him as sacred. He had swallowed and digested and let his body begin the work of extracting nourishment from the food. And then he had walked to the bog, or been carried there, and the Druids had performed their triple death, and his stomach had stopped its work forever. The meal became a fossil, a chemical signature preserved in peat, a message from the past written in grain and pollen, and the last traces of metabolism. And when the scientists read that message, they understood that Lindow Man's death had been prepared for, that he had been fed according to ritual, that his final hours had followed a pattern laid down by generations of ancestors who believed that some deaths required more than just the ending of breath. Chapter 7. The Sacred Waters. The bogs of northern Europe held secrets in their depths, bodies pressed into the peat like pages in a book that no one had learned to read. For centuries, peat cutters working the wetlands would occasionally strike something unexpected, a leathery shape that resolved into human form, and they would recoil or cross themselves or simply rebury what they had found and speak no more of it. Ghost stories grew around these discoveries. Tales of criminals executed and thrown into the marshes, of travellers who had lost their way and drowned, of plague victims hastily disposed of in times of crisis. But the stories were inadequate. They did not explain the patterns that would only become visible when archaeologists began to catalogue the finds and compare them across regions and centuries. Lindow Man was not unique. He was part of a tradition that stretched across the Celtic and Germanic worlds, from Ireland to Denmark, from the Netherlands to northern Germany. Hundreds of bog bodies had been discovered by the 20th century, though many were lost before proper documentation could occur, destroyed by the machinery that found them or reburied by workers who wanted nothing to do with the dead. But enough survived to reveal the pattern. These were not random deaths. These were not unfortunate accidents. These were deliberate placements, bodies given to the water with care and intention, killed in ways that suggested ritual rather than violence born of anger or fear. The first bog body to receive scientific attention was Tolland Man, found in Denmark in M50 by two brothers cutting peat on a spring morning. They saw a face in the trench wall so perfectly preserved that they believed it was a recent corpse, and they notified the police. But when archaeologists arrived and examined the context, they realized the body was ancient, buried in layers of peat that had formed over millennia. The man's face was peaceful, his eyes closed, his lips pressed together as though sleeping. He wore a pointed leather cap and a leather belt, but no other clothing. Around his neck was a braided leather rope, drawn tight, the instrument of his death still in place after 2,000 years. The archaeologists removed Tolland Man with care, preserving the surrounding peat to maintain the body's moisture and prevent collapse. They transported him to the National Museum in Copenhagen, where pathologists and archaeologists worked together to document every detail before decay could set in. The preservation was extraordinary. The skin retained its texture, wrinkled but intact. The hair remained, short and grey. The internal organs were still recognizable, compressed but not destroyed, and the stomach contents revealed a final meal of grain porridge, eaten hours before death. 2 years later, another body emerged from a bog near Grobal, also in Denmark. This man had died violently, his throat cut from ear to ear with such force that the vertebrae were nicked by the blade. But despite the brutality of the wound, the body showed the same careful placement as Tolland Man. He had been laid in the bog deliberately, positioned on his side with his arms and legs arranged. He too was naked except for a leather cape, and he too had eaten a final meal of grain and seeds before his death. The Danish discoveries sparked interest across northern Europe. Museums and archaeologists began to review old records, searching for mentions of bog bodies that had been found and forgotten. In the Netherlands, researchers documented dozens of cases from previous centuries, bodies pulled from peat bogs and either reburied or destroyed. In Germany, the Winderby bog yielded 2 bodies from the Iron Age, one male and one female, both showing signs of violent death. In Ireland, bog bodies began to surface with increasing frequency as mechanical peat extraction expanded across the wetlands. Each discovery added details to the emerging picture. Many of the bodies were naked or nearly naked, stripped of the clothing that would have been valuable to the living. Many showed signs of violent death, but the violence was controlled, specific, not the chaotic wounds of combat or murder. Strangulation was common. Throat cutting appeared repeatedly. Blows to the head, usually to the crown rather than the face or back, marked several victims. And the bodies were young, mostly between 20 and 30 years old, healthy, prior to death, showing no signs of disease or malnutrition that might have made them expendable. The pattern of deposition was also significant. The bodies were not simply thrown into the water. They were placed, sometimes weighted down with stones or wooden stakes to ensure they remained submerged. In some cases, the bodies were deliberately positioned, arms and legs arranged in specific configurations. In other cases, they were bound, hands tied behind backs or legs folded and secured. These details suggested ritual, a formal process carried out by people who understood what they were doing and why. The geographic distribution of the bodies aligned with historical accounts of Celtic and Germanic religious practices. The Romans had written about the Druids in Britain and Gaul, describing that their sacrifices and their veneration of sacred groves and springs. Tacitus had documented Germanic tribes who drowned criminals and cowards in bogs, pressing them down into the mud with hurdles of woven branches. But the Roman accounts were filtered through imperial prejudice, written to justify conquest and portray the conquered as barbaric. The bog bodies themselves provided unfiltered evidence, physical proof that human sacrifice was indeed practiced in these regions, but in ways more complex and ritualized than the Roman writers suggested. The wetlands themselves were sacred spaces in Celtic and Germanic cosmology. Water was understood as a boundary between worlds, a medium through which offerings could pass from the realm of the living to the realm of the gods. Lakes and rivers received countless objects, swords and shields and jewelry and tools, deliberately broken or damaged before being cast into the depths. The breaking was important. It transformed the objects from functional items into gifts that could not be used by mortals, that were meant only for divine recipients. Bogs occupied a special place in this landscape of sacred waters. They were neither fully land nor fully water, shifting and unstable, capable of swallowing the unwary. They produced strange phenomena, gases that bubbled up from the depths, lights that flickered in the darkness, sounds that had no visible source. The people who lived near bogs understood them as places of power and danger, threshold spaces where the natural laws that governed the ordinary world did not fully apply. To give a body to the bog was to give it to the gods who dwelled in such places. The peat would embrace it, the cold water would preserve it, and the acids would transform the flesh into something that could last beyond the normal span of decay. The givers could not have known this last part, could not have understood that their offerings would remain intact for millennia. They believed they were sending the dead onward, releasing them into the other world. But the bogs held on, kept what was given, and eventually returned it to a world that had forgotten the gods who once demanded such gifts. The scientist studying Lindow Man compared his death to those of the other bog bodies, looking for commonalities and differences. The triple death, the blow and the strangulation and the throat cutting, appeared in various combinations across the finds. Tolland Man had been strangled but not cut. Gribala Man had been cut but not strangled. Lindow Man had received both, plus the blow to the head. This variation suggested that while the practice of bog sacrifice was widespread, the specific methods were not rigidly fixed. Different communities or different circumstances might require different approaches, different combinations of violence to satisfy different divine demands. The final meals also varied. Most victims had eaten grain-based foods, porridges or griddle cakes made from barley and wheat and various seeds. But the specific contents differed. Some meals included wild plants, others cultivated grains. Some showed evidence of burning, others did not. The presence of mistletoe in Lindow Man's stomach was unique among the British. Finds, though similar sacred plants appeared in continental examples. These variations suggested local traditions, specific rituals tied to specific landscapes and specific gods. What united all the bog bodies was the care with which they had been killed and deposited. These were not executions carried out in haste or bodies disposed of carelessly. These were offerings, prepared and presented according to rules that governed the relationship between mortals and the divine. The wetlands received them and held them, and the peat did its work, tanning the skin and pressing the flesh until the bodies became part of the bog itself, indistinguishable from the earth around them, except to eyes that knew how to see. 2,000 years passed. The gods to whom these offerings were made faded from memory. The Druids who performed the rituals were hunted to extinction by Rome and replaced by Christian priests who preached a different theology and condemned the old practices as demonic. The wetlands continued their work, accumulating layer upon layer of dead moss, rising slowly as the centuries passed, building archives of pollen and seeds and insects, and buried deep within, the bodies of those who had been given to the water when the world was young and the gods still hungry. Chapter 8. The Face Beneath the Peat. The clay was cool beneath the artist's fingers, grey and pliable, soft enough to shape but firm enough to hold form. It sat upon an armature built from the measurements of a skull 2,000 years old, a framework of wire and wood that replicated the exact dimensions of Lindow Man's head as it had been before the peat compressed it into the earth. The artist worked slowly, building up layers of muscle and tissue according to the anatomical markers preserved in the bone, adding depth where the cheekbones rose and hollowing where the eye sockets receded. This was not imagination. This was reconstruction, a methodical process of bringing a face back from the silence of the bog. The skull itself rested nearby, photographed from every angle, measured in 3 dimensions, its every curve and depression documented in the records. The scientists had provided tables of tissue depth, calculations derived from studies of human anatomy that specified how much flesh should cover each point of the skull's surface. The artist consulted these tables constantly, checking measurements, comparing the emerging clay face to the data that represented 2,000 years of compression and preservation. The goal was accuracy, not artistry. The goal was to show the world what Lindow Man had looked like when he walked beneath Iron Age skies, before the blow and the cord and the blade. The forehead emerged first, sloping back from the brow ridge in the manner characteristic of ancient populations. The artist built up the muscle that would have covered the temporal bones, the thin sheets of tissue that allowed the jaw to move and the face to shift through expressions. The cheekbones came next, broad and slightly prominent, giving the face a structure that suggested strength without aggression. The nose was more difficult. Nasal cartilage does not survive in bog burials, and the shape of the nose must be inferred from the nasal aperture in the skull, from the angle of the bones and the width of the opening. The artist chose a form that was neither too large nor too small, straight but not overly refined, the kind of nose that would have been common among the Celtic peoples of Britain. The eyes were perhaps the most challenging aspect of the reconstruction. The soft tissue of the eyeballs had long since decayed, leaving only the empty sockets in the skull. But the size and shape of the orbits provided clues to the eye's original placement and proportion. The artist sculpted eyelids, careful to match the droop and fold that would have been present in a man of Lindow Man's estimated age, between 20 and 30 years. The eyes themselves would be added later, glass or painted replicas set into the clay, but their placement was crucial. Too high and the face would look startled, too low and it would appear sad. The artist aimed for neutrality, for the expression of someone at rest, neither happy nor sorrowful, simply present. The jaw was reconstructed using measurements from the mandible, the heavy bone that had survived the bog largely intact. The artist built up the masseter muscles, the powerful bands that run from the cheekbone to the jaw and allow for chewing and grinding. Lindow Man's jaw muscles would have been well developed from a lifetime of eating coarse bread and fibrous vegetables, from tearing meat and cracking nuts and performing all the ordinary work of feeding that required strength before the age of refined foods. The chin emerged as the clay accumulated, not particularly prominent but not receding either, a middle ground that suggested neither aristocratic breeding nor peasant stock. The mouth required careful consideration. The teeth had been preserved and they showed wear but no decay, a sign of a diet that was abrasive but low in sugars. The artist modelled the lips to close naturally over these teeth, neither too full nor too thin, shaped to cover without tension. The expression was kept neutral, the corners of the mouth neither turned up in a smile nor pulled down in a frown. This was a face in repose, a face that could belong to anyone, that revealed neither the circumstances of death nor the thoughts that had occupied the mind before the end came. The beard and hair presented their own challenges. The bog had preserved Lindow Man's hair, short and dark, stained reddish by the peat's chemistry, but the original colour was uncertain. Analysis of the hair's keratin suggested it had been brown, perhaps dark brown or black, for the bog transformed it. The artist chose a middle tone, brown with hints of auburn, and began to add hair to the clay head in small sections, each strand implanted individually to create a texture that resembled natural growth. The beard was similarly constructed, covering the lower jaw and upper lip, trimmed short in the manner that was common among Celtic peoples, who favoured facial hair but kept it manageable rather than allowing it to grow wild. As the face took shape, something unexpected happened. The abstract measurements and clinical descriptions began to coalesce into something recognisable. This was no longer a collection of bone fragments and tissue depth charts. This was a person. The face that emerged from the clay had character, a specific arrangement of features that distinguished it from every other face that had ever existed. The eyes, once the glass replicas were added, seemed to look outward with a gaze that was neither hostile nor welcoming, simply observant. The mouth, with its neutral set, suggested someone who was thoughtful rather than impulsive. The overall impression was of competence and calm, the face of someone who had lived a life that required both. The reconstruction was photographed at every stage, the images documenting the transformation from skull to face, from data to person. When it was complete, the clay head was painted, skin tones applied in layers to create the appearance of living flesh. The artist chose a pale complexion, typical of Northern Europeans who spent their lives in climates with limited sunlight. The cheeks were given a slight flush, the suggestion of blood beneath the surface. The lips were coloured a muted red, not vibrant but present, and the eyes were painted to reflect light, to give the impression of moisture and awareness. The completed reconstruction was displayed at the British Museum alongside the preserved body from which it had been derived. Visitors could see both the remains and the face, the leathery skin compressed by peat and the clay features that showed what those remains had once been. The contrast was stark. The body in its glass case was clearly ancient, clearly dead, a relic from a world that no longer existed. But the reconstructed face was immediate, contemporary, the face of someone who could have been walking the streets outside the museum, someone who might have sat across a table or passed on a path, someone whose death was not just a historical fact but a personal tragedy. The scientists who had worked on Lindow Man's case gathered to see the reconstruction. They had spent months examining the body, measuring and sampling and analysing, building a profile from fragments of evidence. But the face brought all that work into sudden focus. This was who they had been studying. This was the person who had eaten the griddle cake with mistletoe, who had walked to the bog's edge, who had received the triple death and been given to the water. The reconstruction did not answer the questions of why or how or what he had believed, but it made those questions more urgent, more personal. This was not an abstract victim of ancient ritual. This was a man with a face, with eyes that had seen the world, with a mouth that had spoken words now lost. Journalists came to photograph the reconstruction, and the images appeared in newspapers and magazines across Britain and beyond. The face of Lindow Man became familiar, recognisable, a symbol of the Iron Age and the mysteries it held. People wrote letters to the museum, sharing their reactions. Some found the face disturbing, a reminder of mortality and the violence that humans can inflict upon one another. Others found it moving, a connection to the past that transcended the centuries. And some saw in the face a resemblance to people they knew, relatives or friends or acquaintances, the features common enough to trigger recognition, even across 2,000 years. The artist who created the reconstruction was careful to emphasize its limitations. This was an approximation, a best guess based on scientific data and anatomical knowledge. The real Lindow Man might have looked somewhat different. His eyes might have been darker or lighter. His nose might have been larger or smaller. His expression might have been harsher or gentler. The reconstruction captured the structure of his face, the underlying architecture of bone and muscle, but it could not capture the qualities that made him unique, the mannerisms and expressions that would have been visible only to those who knew him in life. But despite these limitations, the reconstruction served a purpose. It humanized the remains. It transformed Lindow Man from an object of scientific study into a person with whom viewers could engage emotionally. It made the Iron Age tangible, not a distant abstraction, but a time when people who looked much like people today lived and died and made choices that shaped their communities. The face became a bridge between past and present, between the world of Druids and bogs and human sacrifice, and the world of museums and reconstruction and archaeological inquiry. The clayhead remained on display for years, eventually joined by other reconstructions as more bog bodies were discovered and analysed. Each face was different, each person unique, but together they formed a gallery of the dead that spoke to the persistence of human life across millennia. They had been killed according to rituals that were now incomprehensible, offered to gods whose names were forgotten, buried in places that held them far longer than anyone intended. But they had returned, their faces reconstructed, their stories partially told, and in the quiet halls of the museum, visitors paused before them and wondered what it meant to be chosen, to be sacrificed, to be remembered not by name or deed, but by the shape of a skull, and the skill of an artist who could read bone and clay and bring a face back from the silence of the peat. Chapter 9. The Silence of the Bog. The questions multiplied as the evidence accumulated. each answer revealing new uncertainties, each discovery opening doors that led to rooms without floors. The scientists gathered their data, published their findings, presented their theories at conferences where colleagues debated interpretation and methodology. But beneath the professional discourse ran an undercurrent of acknowledgement that some truths had been buried too deeply to ever fully return. The bog had preserved Lindow Man's body with astonishing fidelity, but it had not preserved his name, his thoughts, his understanding of why he died. Those elements had dissolved into the peat along with everything else that could not be tanned or compressed or held in the chemistry of acidic water. Who was he? The question seemed simple, but it branched into complexities that defied resolution. Was he a druid, a member of the priestly class who presided over rituals and held knowledge passed down through generations? The absence of calluses on his hands suggested he did not perform hard manual labour, and the care taken in his death suggested someone of significance. But druids were described as elderly men, bearded and wise, having spent decades in training. Lindow Man was young, barely into adulthood by modern standards. Could he have been a druid in training, selected before his education was complete? Or was the lack of calluses simply a result of youth, his hands not yet hardened by the work he would have done had he lived longer? Was he a king? Celtic literature preserved stories of rulers who were sacrificed when their reigns failed, when the land became barren or enemies too strong. The king's life was bound to the land's fertility, and if the bond broke, his death could restore it. But kingship in the Iron Age was local and fragmented. There was no unified Britain, no single ruler commanding obedience across the island. Kings were tribal leaders, men who controlled territories that might encompass only a few villages, who rose to power through alliance and warfare, and who fell just as quickly. If Lindow Man had been a king, his kingdom was small enough to leave no trace in the historical record, his name forgotten as soon as his death removed him from living memory. Was he a criminal? Tacitus wrote of Germanic tribes who drowned cowards and deserters in bogs, pressing them down with hurdles to ensure they remained submerged. But the care evident in Lindow Man's death argued against casual execution. Criminals were dispatched with efficiency, not ritual. Their bodies were disposed of, not prepared and offered. The triple death, the final meal with mistletoe, the naked placement in the bog, all these details suggested ceremony rather than punishment. Unless criminality itself could be ritualized, unless certain transgressions required not just death but transformation, the criminal theory seemed inadequate. Was he a volunteer? The absence of defensive wounds suggested he did not struggle, that he either could not resist or chose not to. Later Celtic literatures contained stories of individuals who offered themselves as sacrifices on behalf of their communities, who walked to their deaths believing their lives could purchase safety or prosperity for those they left behind. But voluntary sacrifice required a worldview that modern minds struggle to inhabit, a belief system in which personal annihilation was not just acceptable but honourable. Could a young man, healthy and with decades of life ahead, truly choose such an end? Or was the absence of struggle evidence not of willingness, but of drugs, the mistletoe in his stomach dulling his awareness until resistance became impossible? The season of his death remained uncertain. The mistletoe pollen suggested late winter or early spring, the time when that plant bloomed and released its genetic material to the wind. But mistletoe could be dried and stored, used in ceremonies months after harvest. The bog itself offered no clear seasonal markers. The peat that surrounded Lindow Man had formed over centuries, and the specific layer in which he was found could not be dated precisely enough to determine whether he died in February or August, in the cold grip of winter or the warmth of summer. Each season would have carried different ritual significance. Imbolc in February marked the stirring of spring and the lengthening of days. Beltane in May celebrated fertility and the opening of summer pastures. Lughnasadh in August honoured the first harvest and the gathering of grain. The timing of sacrifice mattered, but the bog kept that secret along with so many others. The identity of his killers was similarly obscured. Druids were the obvious candidates, the priestly class who presided over sacred rituals and determined what the gods required. But how many Druids were present at Lindow Moss on the night of the sacrifice? Was it a single priest performing the triple death alone, or a group, each member responsible for one aspect of the killing? And were there witnesses? Did the community gather to observe, to validate the offering with their presence? Or was the sacrifice performed in secret in the darkness before dawn, known only to those directly involved? The reasons for the sacrifice generated the most speculation and the least certainty. Natural disasters could prompt desperate measures. A failed harvest, crops withering in the fields or rotting in unseasonable rain, might drive a community to offer its most valuable resource in hopes of divine intervention. Disease could have the same effect. Plague spreading through settlements and decimating populations, the living offering one of their own to halt the dying. War was another possibility. If an invasion threatened, if enemies massed beyond the borders, a sacrifice might be performed to ensure victory or to appease gods angered by defeat. But these explanations assumed crisis, assumed the sacrifice was a response to immediate danger. What if it was routine? What if the bogs received offerings regularly on a schedule determined by the calendar rather than circumstance? The wooden trackways leading into Lindow Moss were centuries old, maintained and rebuilt across generations. They suggested the bog was visited often, that people travelled to its depths with enough frequency to warrant permanent paths. If sacrifices occurred on a regular basis, tied to festivals or astronomical events, then Lindow Man's death might have been no more extraordinary than planting in spring or harvesting in autumn, simply part of the rhythm that structured life in the Iron Age. The scientists examined the evidence from every angle, testing hypotheses against the physical remains. They analysed the peat surrounding the body, looking for pollen and seeds and insect remains that might indicate season or environment. They studied the injuries with forensic precision, comparing the wounds to those found on other bog bodies, searching for patterns that might reveal a unified ritual practice across regions. They consulted classical texts, reading Roman and Greek descriptions of Celtic religion with the skepticism such sources deserved, but also with the recognition that even biased accounts might preserve kernels of truth. And still the questions remained. The bog answered only what it could preserve, and much of human experience resists preservation. Beliefs and fears and hopes, the internal landscape of consciousness that motivated behaviour and gave meaning to ritual, these left no trace in the peat. The words spoken as Lindow Man walked to his death, whether prayers or curses or silent acceptance, vanished into the air as soon as they were uttered. The faces of those who killed him, whether sombre or ecstatic or merely dutiful, were never captured in any medium that survived. The reasons they gave themselves and each other, the justifications and explanations that allowed them to take a human life and call it sacred, these existed only in minds that decayed 2,000 years ago. The scientists acknowledged the limits of their discipline. Archaeology could reconstruct behaviour but not thought. It could show what happened but not why it mattered. The body was a text, but a text in a language partly lost, with grammar and vocabulary that had to be inferred from context and comparison. Every interpretation was provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerged or new theoretical frameworks developed. What seemed certain today might appear naive tomorrow. What seemed impossible might become plausible with the next discovery. Some questions would never be answered. Lindow Man's name was lost, and no amount of analysis could retrieve it. The Celtic tribes of Iron Age Britain did not write, or wrote so rarely that almost nothing survived, and oral traditions died with the people who carried them. He would remain anonymous, known only by the place where he was found. His identity reduced to a catalogue number in a museum's records. His personality, the qualities that made him unique, the jokes he told and the songs he sang and the affections he held, all these were gone, irretrievable, dissolved into the same silence that swallowed the Druids and the gods they served. But the body remained, and the body, for all its semblance, still spoke. It said that humans 2,000 years ago believed some deaths were necessary, that the gods required offerings, that life could be traded for life. It said that rituals were precise, method-specific, and that violence could be sacred if performed correctly. It said that bogs were holy, that water was a boundary, and that what was given to the depths would be held and remembered long after the givers were forgotten. These were not small revelations. These were windows into a world that operated according to principles alien to modern sensibilities. A world where the natural and the supernatural were inseparable, where human agency existed within a web of divine influence, and where death was not an ending but a transformation. The silence of the bog was not empty. It was full of absence, full of all the voices and stories and explanations that should have been there but were not. And in that silence the imagination worked, filling gaps with possibilities, constructing narratives from fragments, trying to bridge the distance between the preserved flesh and the vanished world that produced it. The scientists resisted this impulse, trained to distinguish evidence from speculation, to acknowledge uncertainty rather than paper over it with convenient fictions, but even they felt the pull, the desire to know not just what happened but what it meant, to understand not just the mechanics of the triple death, but the worldview that made such a death thinkable. The bog had to preserve the body but not the context, and without context, the body was a riddle, a question mark pressed into the peat, a challenge to everyone who encountered it to imagine a world different enough from their own to make such a death possible. The silence was not a failure of preservation. It was a reminder of everything that preservation could not capture, everything that made the past truly past, separated from the present, not just by time but by the unbridgeable gulf of lost consciousness, lost language, lost gods. Chapter 10. The Vigil at the Museum. The gallery is quiet now, the footsteps muffled by carpet, and the voices of visitors kept low by the presence of the dead. The case stands against the wall, glass panels fitted together with metal frames, climate-controlled to maintain the precise temperature and humidity that prevent further decay. Inside, on a bed of artificial peat moulded to support the body's compressed form, Lindow Man rests. The lighting is dim, adjusted to minimize the damage that photons can inflict on organic material over decades and centuries. The preservation that allowed him to survive 2,000 years in the bog is fragile now, maintained only through constant vigilance, through monitoring and adjustment, and the application of technologies that did not exist when he was found. He lies on his side, knees drawn up, one arm folded beneath him and the other extended forward. The position is fetal, though whether this was how he was placed in the bog or how the peat compressed him over time remains uncertain. The skin is dark, tanned by the bog's chemistry to the colour of old leather, wrinkled and slightly shrunken but still covering the frame beneath. The face is turned toward the glass, the features visible to those who stand close enough, the closed eyes and slightly open mouth giving him an expression that seems almost peaceful, as though he is sleeping rather than dead. The hair is still present, short and reddish-brown, the colour altered by centuries in the peat, but the structure intact. The beard covers the lower jaw, trimmed short, the individual hairs visible under the carefully positioned lights. The hands are curled, the fingers long and slender, the nails trimmed. There are no rings, no bracelets, no ornaments of any kind. He is naked as he was found, unadorned, stripped of everything except the flesh that the bog preserved. Beside the case, a series of panels explain who he was and how he died, or rather, explain what is known and what can only be theorized. The text is measured, academic, avoiding sensationalism but acknowledging the violence that ended his life. Photographs show the excavation site, the trench where the peat cutters first glimpsed his back, the careful process of removing him from the bog in sections. X-rays reveal the fractured skull, the displaced vertebrae, the cord still wrapped around the throat. Diagrams illustrate the triple death, the blow and the strangulation and the throat cutting, each method described with clinical precision. The visitors come in a steady stream, pausing before the case, reading the panels, leaning close to see the details. Some are tourists, drawn to the museum by guidebooks that list Lindow Man as one of the must-see exhibits. Others are students, brought by teachers who use the body to illustrate lessons about Iron Age Britain, about ritual sacrifice, about the methods of preservation that allow archaeologists to study the distant past. Still others are scholars, researchers from universities and museums around the world, coming to see for themselves the evidence they have read about in journals and monographs. They stand in silence mostly, or speak in hushed tones, as though raising their voice would disturb the figure in the glass. There is something about the presence of a body, even one so ancient, that commands respect. This is not a skeleton, bones cleaned and reassembled and mounted for display. This is a person, recognisably human. Despite the distortions of time and preservation, the skin is intact, the face is visible, the sense of individual identity persists even though the identity itself is lost. Children press their faces to the glass, fascinated and repelled in equal measure. They ask their parents if it hurts to die that way, if he knew what was happening, if he was scared. The parents answer as best they can, simplifying the complex theories into stories that children can understand. He was chosen, they say. It was a long time ago. People believed different things then. The answers are inadequate, but they suffice, and the children move on to other exhibits, other wonders, leaving Lindow Man to his vigil. The museum staff check the case daily, monitoring the temperature and humidity, inspecting the seals for any sign of degradation. They know that without constant care, the body will deteriorate, the skin drying and cracking, the structure collapsing as the moisture that gives it form evaporates. Every year, specialists are brought in to assess the condition, to recommend adjustments to the preservation protocols, to ensure that future generations will be able to see what this generation sees. The body is no longer just a relic. It is a responsibility, a trust placed in the hands of those who have the knowledge and resources to maintain it. Occasionally, the museum receives requests to return Lindow Man to the bog, to rebury him where he was found and let him rest undisturbed. These requests come from various quarters, from modern Druids who see the display as disrespectful, from indigenous rights activists who argue that the dead should not be exhibited, from members of the public who feel uneasy about the idea of keeping a human body in a glass case for people to stare at. The museum considers these requests seriously, consulting with ethicists and community representatives, weighing the value of public education against the claims of dignity and respect. But Lindow Man remains on display. The justification is educational, the argument that his body serves as a teaching tool, a primary source document that connects people to a past that would otherwise exist only in abstract descriptions and reconstructed models. He is evidence of a world that operated according to different rules, a world where human sacrifice was not an aberration, but a practice embedded in religious and social structures. To remove him from view, the museum argues, would be to erase that evidence, to make it easier for people to dismiss the past as irrelevant, or to romanticize it beyond recognition. The debates continue, unresolved, recurring whenever a new director takes charge or a new ethical framework gains prominence. And through it all, Lindow Man lies in his case, silent and patient, unchanged by the arguments that swirl around him. He has been dead for 2,000 years. He has lain in the bog for 1,980 of those years. He has been in the museum for 40. The passage of time, which once must have seemed urgent and pressing when he was alive, has become meaningless. He exists now in a kind of eternal present, neither alive nor truly gone, suspended between the world he knew and the world that studies him. The gallery empties as closing time approaches. The guards make their rounds, ensuring that all the visitors have left, that the doors are locked, that the security systems are armed. The lights dim further, reduced to the minimum necessary for the overnight sensors. The temperature drops slightly, adjusted for the absence of warm bodies and their exhalations, and Lindow Man is left alone, or as alone as one can be when surrounded by cameras and monitors and the infrastructure of modern security. In the darkness, the case becomes a small island of illumination, the body within still visible to anyone who might pass through the gallery in the night. But no one does. The museum sleeps, its treasures locked away, its stories held in suspension until morning brings visitors back to wake them. Lindow Man's story, like all the stories held in museums, exists in fragments, in the artifacts and labels and educational materials that attempt to explain what cannot be fully known. He is a window and a mirror showing viewers something of the past while reflecting their own assumptions and questions back at them. What did he think in those final hours? Did he walk to the bog willingly, believing his death would serve some greater purpose, or was he taken by force, his compliance ensured by drugs or restraints? Did he pray, calling on gods whose names are now forgotten, or did he curse, raging against the fate that required his death? Did he think of family, of people who would mourn him, or was he beyond such considerations, focused only on the immediate present and the pain that was coming? The questions have no answers. The body cannot speak, and the world that produced it has vanished. But the questions persist, asked by everyone who stands before the case and tries to imagine what it was like, what it meant, what it felt like to be the person whose preserved remains lie behind the glass. The act of asking transforms the body from object to subject, from thing to person, even if the answers never come. Outside, the city continues its ceaseless motion, traffic moving through streets, lights burning in windows, people going about their lives with the confidence that comes from not thinking too deeply about mortality or the strangeness of consciousness. Inside, the museum holds its vigil, preserving fragments of the past so that the present might understand where it came from and how different things once were, and at the centre of one gallery, in a case carefully maintained and constantly monitored, Lindow Man rests. The most famous resident of the peat, the body that returned from the bog to tell a story that will never be complete. The night deepens, the city quiets, and the vigil continues as it has for decades, as it will for decades more, until the day when preservation fails or priorities shift and the body is finally allowed to return to silence. But that day has not come yet. For now he remains held in the glass, held in the light, held in the attention of everyone who comes to see him and leaves changed, however slightly, by the encounter with a death that was never meant to be witnessed by eyes 2,000 years in the future. The candle has burned low, the chamber has fallen silent, and history once again holds its breath in the dark, waiting for the next person to arrive, to look, to wonder, and to carry forward the story of the man who died in the bog and would not decay. The story of Lindow Man concludes here. His body remains on display at the British Museum, a testament to the rituals of the Iron Age and the preservation power of the peat. Though his name is lost and the exact reasons for his death may never be known, he continues to teach us about a world where the boundaries between life and death, earth and water, mortal and divine, were understood very differently than they are today. Thank you for journeying through the dark chapter of history with the Bedside Historian. May you rest well.